So as I was saying, we begin to get the idea at this time that the Avesta, Spengler believes that the Avesta was originally written in Aramaic, even though that's lost, but that it was disseminated in Pahlavi, which is the language more or less that comes in right around 200 BC. And then Pahlavi itself is displaced by Aramaic. The Parthians, the correct date for the Achaemenid Empire, I remember the date now, it's actually 500 BC to 300 BC. It's overthrown by Alexander and the Seleucids. Then we get 200 BC, the Parthians, to 200 AD. And then Aramaic, the Parthians are then followed by the Sassanids, and then the Sassanids are later converted to Islam. So that's the embarrassed, roughest outline, the history of the Persians. Pahlavi, though, is displaced by Aramaic. Aramaic begins to work its way east, and it becomes the major language of the entire Middle East during this time. And so Spengler believes that the Avesta was probably originally written in Aramaic. And this may also explain why during this time the Indians, the Hindus, pick up writing. For the first time it begins to appear in their civilization about 400 BC in the Brahmi script. And the Brahmi script, most scholars believe to be derived from Aramaic. And so this eastward dispersion and diffusion of Aramaic thoroughly Semitizes the Persians, and this is why Spengler believes they can be included in the Magian civilization. They don't necessarily have to be regarded as an Indo-Germanic people. So this is his drawing of the boundary from Byzantium to Persia as a single Magian civilization. And so we get the idea, what Spengler wants to emphasize then here is the shift during this time from tribalism to the creation of nations. And with regard to the Magians, we of course have at this time with the Jews, the emphasis all along had been on tribalism. We get the original 12 tribes that settled Israel and Judah, and we also have there with Israel and Judah two completely distinct kingdoms, basically the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And it may be the case that we have, in the case of the united monarchy, which is united first with David and Solomon, centered in Jerusalem, long about the year 1000 BC. But we have two founders, and the one founder is Abraham, the other is Moses, representing a dual pseudomorphosis on the Jews themselves. The mother and father, as it were, of the Jews is Abraham, who comes out of the city of the moon god Ur. Ur was the city in Mesopotamia that was sacred to the moon god Sin, Nana Sin. And Abraham, supposedly around 1800 BC, leaves that city, migrates up north, then goes over and comes down through Palestine to Haran, then goes down into Egypt, comes out of Egypt, and settles eventually in Haran. And this may account for the migrations during this period of the northern tribes. Most of the tribes are northerners. The 10 basic tribes are northern. Then we have the two other tribes that supposedly came out of the south and made up Judah, the kingdom of Judah, the Levites, who were the priestly group, and another group that I've temporarily forgotten, but they are led out by Moses out of Egypt during the Exodus period, which occurs many generations after Abraham. The Exodus period, generally scholars believe it to have occurred under the reign of Ramses II, in the middle of somewhere around 1300 BC. And we get a congeries of groups coming out, led by Moses, and the Levites seem to have been connected to a snake-worshipping cult, which sheds light, of course, on Moses transforming the staff into a serpent. The term Levi is related to Leviathan, the great serpent. So they were originally serpent worshippers, and there's the vestiges still of a serpent cult adhering to the various descriptions of the Jews wandering through the deserts of Sinai. And then eventually they wind up slowly penetrating north into Palestine, where eventually they form the kingdom of Judah. So we have two separate kingdoms there, Israel and Judah. And the reason that David conquers Jerusalem and uses it as the center, the political capital, is because Jerusalem was not a Jewish city. There was a people there that was there that he kicked out and then took it over because it was a politically neutral place that could then therefore function as the political center for the United Monarchy. It didn't last very long. After Solomon, of course, it disintegrates back into the north and the south again. And then we get the period of the dissolution. But Spengler wants to emphasize that all of this tribalism, where one's identity is traced through descent through the bloodline to some ancient ancestor, ultimately to Adam, of course, but ideally through the 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah down to Abraham, is the rise of the Magian consensus community, which begins to spring up now as basically the model being a religion of credo. All you have to do is say, I believe, and you can become a Nestorian, a Monophysite, a Mandean, a Manichaean, what have you. The Mandeans, by the way, are an interesting group because they worshiped John the Baptist, not Christ. They rejected Christ. For them, the primary savior figure, the anthropos of light who had descended from heaven to earth, was John the Baptist. And the Mandeans are actually confined to the marsh regions in southern Iraq at the head of the Persian Gulf, about the area where, or at least not far from, where Eridu, one of the oldest cities and the southernmost of all the ancient Sumerian cities, had been. And the primary god of Eridu was Enki, the water god, who was the lord of baptism. His original name was Ea, and the word John, Owanes, may originally relate to the name of this god, Ea, who was associated with a fish cult, exorcism, and baptism. And the original idea of baptism wasn't rebirth. It was the idea of descending into the water, washing yourself clean of demons, and then coming out. It was symbolic of, it was linked with the ancient Mesopotamian exorcist rites. But in any event, so there may be some obscure linkage between why the Mandeans worshiped John the Baptist, who was, after all, probably originally he was an Essene, and the Essenes practiced baptism, as did the Christians. This was a cult taken over from the Christians, and it's possible that Christ introduced it into Christianity, perhaps as an apostle of John the Baptist who carried over this baptismal rite. In any event, all you have to do is undergo the sacrament at this time, and you become part of the Magian consensus community, which is the basic political configuration, which is identical with the spiritual group that Spengler says is constitutive of the social unit, the political unit of the Magian civilization. Whereas with the Greeks we had the city-state, which was geographically bound. With the Faustian civilization we have the nation-state, which is also geographically bound, but which incorporates within it multiple religions. You can have multiple religions within a Faustian nation-state. Not so in the Magian political configuration. Each one is intolerant of all the others, and each one has only one basic religion as part of its identity. So it's not geographically bound. It's fundamentally a diasporic or dispersive model, which is why I think Magian residues and fellaheen peoples such as Al-Qaeda do so well today, in an age in which the internet favors the diasporic type of model that isn't bound to a geographical locality. And then Spengler says that the Western Jews are part of the fellaheen of the Jewish civilization, just as the Greek Balkans are part of the fellaheen of the Byzantine, which is the westernmost aspect of the Magian civilization. And by fellaheen, of course, Spengler means he has defined primitives as the tribal groups that precede the springtime period when the culture rises and you get the shift from the village and the fortress stronghold to castle and cathedral, and the rise of the town, and the process of Saneacism, in which the towns join together to form cities, and cities to form nations. That's the Saneacism process there. And with the Magian civilization, you get a much broader, more diffuse sense of identity. But this fellaheen idea that he comes up with, fellah in Arabic, it's originally an Arabic term which means farmer. And it was originally applied to the Egyptian peasants who were there in Egypt after the period of the Romans. And so they have this sense. Spengler takes the term and generalizes it to refer to those peoples which survive the great metabolisms of the historical processes of the civilizations. Once they've gone through the agonies of their metabolisms, through both the culture and the civilization phases and the creation of the imperium, and the imperium disintegrates, and all that's left of a people, which Spengler says is basically what we have in these civilizations today, is the fellaheen population. They've returned to a zoological existence. They're ahistoric. They may continue to perpetuate and preserve the ancient fixed stock of symbol forms from the civilization that they have come out of, but they're basically peasants, have a peasant mentality, and of course the peasant house form, the peasant symbol world continues onward and can exist in these landscapes forever. So that's his idea of the fellaheen population that he sees coming out of this. Now he says that each one of the nation states in the West, the Saneacism process comes out of around the year 1000, when we begin to see the shift from Franks and Lombards and Visigoths to Germans, Italians, Spaniards, the French. Each one of these now groups themselves around a national identity at about this time, around 1000 AD. And each one has a different idea. We have seen in his essay on Prussianism and socialism that the fundamental economic and political idea of the British was the Viking, every man for himself, sort of piratical mentality of the world as booty, as plunder that exists for the individual to get as much as he can. There's a weak state as a result of this. America has, of course, inherited that with its idea of dismantling, keeping the state out of business, the laissez-faire ideal. Then with the Prussians, of course, we get the idea, the opposite idea of the state as a formation to which the individual is subordinate. We have the Italian anarchist idea in which city-states, each one of them is in it for themselves and is short-sighted politically. With the Spaniards, we get the idea, the universalism for the first time in the West of a sense of a universal empire building that begins with the Spaniards and which fueled their Western conquests and the discovery, of course, of the Americas. Each one has their own ideal, even though they are all subordinated and unified by being part of that group, that organism known as Faustian civilization, for which the primary symbol is infinite space and of which all the nation states within that configuration are metabolizing and working out this idea of the mythology of the individual, the temporal evolution over time, and so forth. And so long about 1000 AD, we get the shift then. In Germany, we get the shift from these tribes to the ideal of the Kaiser, with the Holy Roman Empire being the primary idea. The Prussian state eventually comes out of that. In the south, with the French, we get the Franks and the Visigoths unite together under the idea of the ideal king. For them, Charlemagne was, of course, the first of them. And so we get the ideal king there, and we begin to get these nationalities forming into peoples, and these peoples then that eventually comprise and compose Faustian civilization. So this is the idea of Saneacism that he sees as central to this process. And during this period, he says, in each one of these phases, there is a central esoteric social group in each one of these phases. In the springtime phase, the primary esoteric culture group that gives to a civilization its sense of national identity are, of course, the nobility, the great chivalrous knights and so forth who go on the crusades. The nobility handles the West's sense of identity down to somewhere in the middle of its summer and autumn periods, when it shifts with the rise of the merchant classes to the burgher. The burgher begins to give it, the bourgeois begins to give it a new sense of identity under the age of mercantile capitalism first, which then gives way, of course, to industrial capitalism, where we shift from exchange of goods and the mercantile capitalism invented by the Italians to the manufacture of goods invented by the British in the Industrial Revolution. And that, of course, as Quigley had said, devolves down into monopoly capitalism, which is under disintegration, undergoing the disintegration process right now. And then in the late phase, though, in the megalopolitan phase of high civilization, he says that what happens then is that at the end of a civilization, you can see the earliest origins of the fellaheen population emerging from the megalopolitan urban masses, which are, during the civilization phase, uprooted from their countryside, and they're formless and they're urban. They're basically nomadic as they drift through these cities, and they are formless and therefore fellaheen. And the primary esoteric individuals who lead these masses are the literary types, the literary intellectuals that are the architects of socialism, Marx and Proudhon and all of these individuals that begin to spread this nihilistic world sentiment of socialism. And they begin to also whenever they begin to spread a sentiment of the idea of world peace, which begins to spread through the population. Spengler says the problem with this sentiment, this mentality, ideally it's a good one, but the practical problem turns out to be that there are really only two roles in history. You can either play the hammer or the anvil. Those are the only two roles. And once a society lays down its arms and flips over to a mode of world peace, as for example the Romans do after Augustus with the settling of the empire, the civil wars die out and we get the Pax Romanica, it lays itself open to conquest by other peoples, whether they be, as in the case of the Romans, barbarians, or in the case of Tamerlane the Great, he says in 1400 AD, wipes out Baghdad. The Baghdadian population did not defend itself, and he simply wiped them out and created giant piles of human skulls, 100,000 human skulls piled up in these huge piles. He was incredibly savage. But that, Spengler says, is the result of what happens to a population when it decides that it's going to opt for peace and not defend itself. It will be conquered at one point by another group, whether it's a barbarian population, tribal populations that come in and dismantle the Roman Empire, and in doing so lay the foundation for European civilization or not. But that is the end result of the civilization, and the fellaheen comes out of this idea, this spread of sentiment of world peace.